Well, Shabbat Shalom, friends. Thank you for being here this morning. In case you were wondering, in the state of Alabama, it is illegal to wear a fake mustache in church if it causes laughter. In the state of Arizona, it is illegal for a donkey to sleep in a bathtub. In California, it is illegal to whistle for a lost canary prior to 7 a.m. And in Florida, it is illegal to sing in a public place while wearing a swimsuit. One more for now, in case you were wondering. In the state of Georgia, these are laws that are actually on the book still, it is illegal to tie a bath to a telephone pole or a street lamp. Where do these laws come from? What could possibly be the story behind them? Well, Deuteronomy is full of laws. As I mentioned a little earlier, more in this particular Torah portion than in any other one in the entire Torah. Really a challenge to choose 1, 2, 3. I'm going to go with 1 for today. As some of you know, I love intertextuality. Words that appear in one place and you can find them in another, particularly when they're rare. I love to think about the connections between them. I didn't really think that what I was noticing in part of what Rabbi Reuben read today was a chidush, as we say, certainly not something brand new, but I was relieved actually to be validated and uplifted by many teachers. We'll focus today on bringing some of the teachings of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory. He always managed to just go right to the heart of things. So I was noticing in this little section, this was from our second Aliyah today. If a man has 2 wives, one loved and the other unloved, the word is literally senu'ah, which means hated, unfortunately, and both the loved and the hated wife, the unloved wife, bear him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the hated wife, the unloved wife. Then when the man wills his property to his sons, as was done, he must not give the rights of the firstborn to the son of the beloved wife, in preference to his actual firstborn, son of the wife that is senu'ah, unloved or hated. The man must recognize the legal rights of the firstborn of his hated, unloved wife, so as to give him a double share of all he has, for he is the first of his father's strength, and the birthright is legally his. Deuteronomy 21, verses 15 through 17. The law makes a lot of sense. In biblical Israel, the firstborn was entitled to a double share in his father's inheritance, but what the law tells us is that this is not at the father's discretion. He can't choose to transfer this privilege from one son to another. In particular, he can't do this by favoring the son of the wife he loves most, if in fact the firstborn son came from another less loved wife. These first 3 laws in this Torah portion, the captive woman taken in the course of war, this law about the rights of the firstborn, and the stubborn and rebellious son, are all about dysfunctions within the family. What's extraordinary about this is that this particular set of laws about the, quote, unloved or hated wife seems to be in absolute conflict with a really prominent narrative in the Torah. If we were together in person, some of you would probably call out, as I did when I read the section again more closely, it would remind you of Jacob and his 2 wives, which we'll hear still in a number of weeks, but it's coming. Leah and Rachel were treated and cared for very differently in the surface level reading of our Torah. But this section in Deuteronomy makes an absolutely clear verbal connection between the 2 passages. One, the most obvious, is the pair of opposites, loved versus unloved, ahuva versus senu'ah. This is exactly the language with which the Torah describes Rachel and Leah. Remember that when Jacob was fleeing his home to his uncle Laban, Jacob fell in love at first sight with Rachel. He worked 7 years for her hand in marriage, but on the night of the wedding, Laban substituted his elder daughter Leah. When Jacob complained, "Why have you deceived me?" Laban says, "It's not done in our place to give the younger before the elder." Jacob agreed to work 7 more years for Rachel, but contrary to sort of popular myth, he didn't wait another 7 years before marrying Rachel. The wedding takes place about a week later, but he was indentured for another 7 years. That part is true, but the wedding took place a week later. Can you imagine? God saw that Leah was unloved, Senuah, and God opened her womb, but Rachel remained barren. In the Haftarah, the mentions of barrenness and fertility actually tie in very much, I think, to this Torah portion, even though it's not supposed to be a direct link at this time of year. But we've got a lot of these themes that will be coming up in Genesis, being sort of primed, if you will, right now. Leah calls her firstborn Reuben, but her hurt at being the Senuah, less loved, remained. And we read this about the birth of her second son. She became pregnant and had a son, Genesis 29. She says, "God has heard that I was Senuah, unloved, and he gave me this son." She names the child Simeon. The word Senuah appears only 6 times in the entire Torah. I love words like that. Senuah appears only 6 times in the Torah. Twice in the passage about Leah, the other 4 times in this parsha, in connection with the laws of the rights of the firstborn. There's an even arguably stronger connection. This weird phrase, "first of his father's strength," appears only twice in the Torah. Here, for he is the first of his father's strength, and in relation to Reuben, Leah and Jacob's firstborn. Genesis 49, toward Israel, Jacob's passing, he says, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the first of my strength, first in rank and first in power." So the close readers among us can't help but hear in the law in our portion some kind of commentary on Jacob's conduct in terms of his own sons. But what must ring very loudly for us is that the conduct of Jacob is precisely the opposite of what is legislated here. Jacob did transfer the right of the firstborn from Reuben, his actual firstborn, son of the Senuah, poor Leah, to Joseph, the firstborn of the Ahuva, of the loved Rachel. That is pretty hard to read. Reuben should have received a double portion, but with Jacob's last days and breaths on earth, he transfers the double portion to Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, really rubbing it in. Now, the traditional rabbis absolutely assert that the patriarchs observed the whole Torah, even before it was given. But for a long time, many of us have acknowledged that this is probably an overstatement, because looking at the simple, plain text of our Torah, we see that not every law is exactly the same before and after the covenant of Sinai. We see that in the behavior of our ancestors. So we've got a real contradiction between Genesis and Deuteronomy. There are many others, conflicts between the early stories in the Torah and how the law gets laid down later. Not least the very fact that Jacob marries 2 sisters, which is absolutely forbidden in Leviticus 18, verse 18. Nachmanides suggests that the patriarchs observed the Torah only while they were living in the land of Israel, and some of these situations took place outside of the land of Israel. That's one option. Commentator Abarbanel suggests that Jacob transferred the double portion from Reuben to Joseph by particular divine instruction, to suggest that in the case of Joseph, that was an exception, not a precedent. And Sforno, one of my favorite commentators, suggests that the Deuteronomy prohibition applies only when the transfer of the firstborn's rights happens because the father favors one wife over another. It acknowledges that these things happen sometimes, and they lay out a precedent that says this must not happen. But there's another possible explanation altogether. The Torah is a unique book because it combines both law and history. In many other places, there are different genres. Law is an answer to the question, what can we do? And history is an answer to the question, what happened? In many places across Western civilization and many other cultures, there's no obvious relationship between law and history. Judaism, never one to shy away from a dilemma, has it not so? In many cases, we do have in our civil law a connection between law and history, between what happened and what we should or should not do. But it's not always clean, as we see here. Jacob does a number of things that the later law seems to suggest should not have been done. This is an aware tradition. Not always perfect, but attempting to be aware of what happened and to do better by it. It is the basis for so many of the laws, at least that practice of looking at what happened and somebody saying there ought to be a law that we see in so many of these wonderfully crazy and confusing laws that we have still today. This idea of law and history is the subject of a very famous essay, it's not for the faint of heart, by Robert Cover. It's called Nomos and Narrative. It appeared in the mid-'80s in the Harvard Law Review. His view was that, I'm going to read this twice, no set of legal institutions or prescriptions exists apart from the narratives that locate it and give it meaning. For every constitution, there is an epic. For every decalogue, there is a scripture. I love that. I'll read that last part again. For every constitution, there is an epic. For every decalogue, there is a scripture. So much of biblical law comes directly from the Israelites' experience of slavery, as if to say, this is what our ancestors suffered, don't do likewise. Don't oppress your workers. Don't turn an Israelite into a lifelong slave. Don't leave your servants or employees or animals without a weekly day of rest, and so on. Not all of biblical law is like this, but some is. It represents truth learned through experience. As Rabbi Sachs says, justice as it takes shape through the lessons of history. The Torah and Judaism takes the past as a guide to the future, often positive, but sometimes also negative. This law here in Deuteronomy is an attempt to correct the behavior of our most exalted ancestors, the people after whom we are named. We know that Jacob did what he did as an expression of love. His feeling for Rachel was overwhelming, as it was for Joseph, her elder son. Love is absolutely central to Judaism. Just look at Ner Tamid's ark, where we have the word, and you shall love, right next to the word, and you shall love. Absolutely central. That's a choice. That's a statement. That's saying this is the principle upon which we are most based. But I have to disagree with the Beatles. Love is not all you need. Judaism has disagreed with that notion for millennia. Love is central to Judaism, but it's not enough. We have to have justice and the impartial application of the law. People, all of us here today in this very moment, have to feel that the law is on the side of fairness. You can't build a society on blind love alone. Love unites, but it divides. It leaves the senu'ah, the less loved, feeling abandoned, neglected, or disregarded, even hated. And it can leave in its wake, just look at Jacob and his family, strife, envy, and a vortex of violence and revenge. The Torah, when it uses verbal association to link the law in Deuteronomy with the story of Jacob in Genesis, it's teaching us that the law isn't arbitrary. It might seem so, but it is supposed to be rooted in the experience of history. Laws, so many of the wonderful and crazy ones that maybe don't hurt anyone too much, thank God, but make us laugh a little bit. But the real laws, the laws upon which our society stands or falls, they're supposed to be a way of putting right what went wrong in the past. We have to love, but we have to know the limits of love and the importance of justice as fairness, not just in families, although that's where it's most important probably, because those families set the stage for a greater society and the potential of what we can do together. It's a perfectly imperfect system, but no one is above the law, or our society is headed over a cliff. Let's slow down, cool our jets before we get there. I'll leave you with these couple of very foul laws. One refers to a law in Georgia's Quitman County, which says actually, well, I'll start you with Minnesota because that's where I am. We'll end with Georgia. I like that one even better. I'm in Minnesota, and here in this fine state, there is a law that actually says a person may not cross state lines with a duck atop his or her head. So don't try it if you were thinking of doing it. And finally, in Georgia's Quitman County, in fact, there is a law in the books that says chickens are in fact not permitted to cross the road. Shabbat Shalom.